We're going to be graphing tangent now. How tangent works is we're not just going to be working with the first quadrant, we're going to be working with the fourth quadrant and the first quadrant. For the fourth quadrant, that's our negative values. So we're starting it at negative pi over 2, and we're ending it at pi over 2. Now, the y value underneath means undefined. That means that there's a vertical asymptote. Nothing can cross a vertical asymptote. So 2 of our values are already done. Now, negative pi force is negative 1. And then 0 is 0, and pi force is 1. And what we have is a curve that's approaching both of the vertical asymptotes, and it's never crossing it. So what we're going to do is we're going to take that parent function, and we're going to use that for each of our tangent values. So when we're doing this, what we have is y equals tangent of theta plus 2. We're going to have our table, theta and y. We're starting it at negative pi halves, negative pi force, 0, pi force, and pi halves. Our first and last for tangent are always undefined. And then what we have is our first value is negative 1, but when we add 2, it's 1. The tangent of 0 is 0, plus 2 is 2. And the tangent of pi force is 1, plus 2 is 3. So what we have is a value at 3. Remember, we're going to have our vertical asymptotes at pi halves, negative pi halves, and pi halves. We draw our vertical asymptotes. And we're going to plot our points. 1, 2, 3. We don't want to draw a straight line. We want to make sure that our arrows are approaching our asymptote. And that would be our graph. Now, looking at letter B, we're going to do the same thing. We have theta and y. We have the 0. We have the negative pi force, pi halves, negative pi force, 0, pi force, and pi halves. We start with undefined, we end with undefined. Now we're going to plug in each of our values into our tangent. So if we take negative 1 and times it by 2, it's negative 2. Anything times 0 is 0. And then 1 times 2 is 2. And remember, we're going to put our pi halves and our negative pi halves. We draw vertical asymptotes. This is an imaginary line where the graph does not cross. So we have negative 2, 0, and 2. Now, looking at letter C, we have our same table. We're starting off with 0. Sorry, I don't know why I keep on doing that. We're starting off with negative pi halves. And then what we have is negative pi force, 0, pi force, and we have pi halves. So we have our first one being undefined, our last one being undefined. Then we plug in a negative 1, and that gives us positive 3 minus 1 is 2. Then we plug in a 0. 3 times 0 is 0, minus 1 is negative 1. Then we plug in a 1. Negative 3 times 1 is negative 3, minus 1 is negative 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to start this at negative pi halves, and we're going to end it at pi halves. We have our vertical asymptotes. And then what we do is plot our point. Negative pi force and 2, and 0 and -1. And what we have is pi force and -4. Now, if we're looking at this graph right here, notice that it's different than the other ones. This one's going down, and the other ones were going up. And the reason why is because the negative in front of the tangent. Now, let's look at 3 more examples. If we're looking at letter D, negative pi force, negative pi halves. We have 0, pi halves, and pi force. We're going to be plugging in the values. It starts with undefined, it ends with undefined. When we plug in the -1, we get -2 minus 1, which is -3. When we plug in a 0, that gives me -1. And when I plug in a 1, that gives me 2 minus 1, which is 1. And if we're looking at it, hopefully you notice my mistake. It should be negative pi halves, negative pi force, and pi halves. Our first one is undefined, and our last one is undefined. We have -3, we have -1, and what we have is 1. Remember, we want lines that approach the asymptotes. So we have negative pi halves, negative pi force, 0, pi force, and pi halves. We start with undefined, we end with undefined. When we plug in a -1, it becomes a -3 plus 3 is 0. When we plug in a 0, it becomes 0, so we have 3. And when we plug in a 1, we get 6. I'm going to go by 2's. So we have we have our vertical asymptotes. We have our point at 0. We have it at 3. And what we have it is at 6. We're going to make sure that the arrows look like they're approaching the asymptote. And that would be it for E. Looking at letter F, we have our theta, we have our y. We're starting with negative pi halves, negative pi force, 0, pi force, and pi halves. We start with undefined, we end with undefined. When we plug in a -1, this is a little tricky because a negative is a positive, so it's actually a 2. When we plug in a 0, it's a 1. And when we plug in a 1, that gives us 0. So we have our vertical asymptotes at the beginning and at the end for tangent. Then we have 2, we have 1, and we have 0. Notice that the tangent curve is going down, and the reason why is because our tangent is negative.